Hi, and welcome to Jill Pearson's Profile. I'm your host, Jill Pearson. On each show, we'll talk with one person who's accomplishing something interesting these days. And today, our guest is Wendy Murphy. Wendy is a well-known legal analyst who appears on a lot of TV shows. She's an adjunct professor at New England Law, Boston. She is an author of 2 books, and she is the mother of 5 children. She is an impact litigator who specializes in representing victimized women and children. And Wendy, thank you so much for being here today.
I'm delighted to be here for your first debut run. I love it.
Well, it's so nice of you. Most people know you from TV, but that's not really your job, is it?
Not even a little bit. Yeah, I mean, in terms of my visibility, it seems like that's my primary job, not just one of the things I do, but I do it a lot. I probably do TV, depending on what the issues are, 3 to 5 times a week. Less so during political campaigns, that's not my field, but on average about 3 to 5 times a week. So anyone who knows me thinks that's my actual career. But I do that probably 2% of the time. My primary work is as an academic, an activist, an impact litigator, a lawyer, or as my kids would say, she's a teacher, she's a lawyer, and she helps people.
That's very nice.
All my hats.
Okay. So tell us about your impact litigation. What have been some of the highlights, the cases where you've really made an impact nationally?
Wow, it's hard to choose my favorite, and I know that wasn't what you asked me, but the cases are so complicated, but let me see if I can say them in a very short period of time. Several years ago, I had a really great case in Nebraska, and I do this all over the country, by the way. Wherever the good case is, I go. And as an impact litigator, you can't wait for the right test case to show up in Massachusetts. So if it shows up in Nebraska, I go. And it involved a rape victim who, during the trial, right before the trial, was told by the judge that she couldn't use the word rape during her testimony. And then the judge gave her a list of other things she couldn't say. She wasn't allowed to refer to what happened to her as a sexual assault. She had to call the sexual assault nurse examiner the sexual examiner. It was the strangest thing. And he gave her a list of words she was disallowed to use. She couldn't call herself a victim. This is a young woman who at the time was in college. She was attacked by a strange man who drugged her and took her to his apartment. It was a disgusting, horrible, very brutal crime. And she was pretty outraged. Like, why would you tell me what words I can use to describe violence against my body? I can call it whatever I want. It's up to me. And in fact, she had a gut instinct that she should be able to call it whatever she wants. But in fact, she has a constitutional right to call it whatever she wants. She has a mandatory obligation to tell the truth, and that means using whatever words are the truth. And yet this judge forbade her under threat of incarceration. And I went down there and I said, Judge, you can't do this. You don't have the power to command a human being what words to use in her own testimony describing what happened to her. And the judge was outraged that I showed up there. He was very offended. But long story short, he dismissed the case because she wouldn't agree to obey his illegal order. And the good news is I sued the judge in federal court. And again, the judge couldn't believe it and was just, I thought it was so audacious that a victim and a lawyer from Boston would show up in Nebraska federal court and try to file a lawsuit against a judge. And it wasn't for money. It was a lawsuit to the federal court, a lawsuit to command the state court judge to abide by the Constitution. And eventually we won. And we won in a very curious way that happens to me a fair amount, which is to say they don't like lawyers to come in and shake the trees the way that I do, but when you're right, you're right. So I won in the sense that the federal court wrote in a footnote, it is, after telling me that I was, over the top to show up in their state and do my work, they then dropped a footnote that said, On the other hand, it is profoundly disturbing that a judge in a rape case would order a rape victim not to use the word rape. Indeed, it is reminiscent of the kinds of things we hear about from countries where women wear burqas. So that was a huge victory in the kind of case I handle. Winning a footnote, winning a dissenting opinion is a big deal because I'm really changing systems. And that's the kind of work I do. When something violates the constitutional rights of a crime victim, it's usually a woman or a child in my cases, but not always, sometimes a man or a boy, then I like to go in and talk about the constitutional rights of victims because you know this, a criminal case, the parties are the Commonwealth, the government versus the defendant, the perpetrator. And the perpetrator has a lawyer, but when bad things happen to the victim, and she's not a party, she has no status in the case, who protects her rights? The answer is, I do. I'm not the only one, but I'm one of a very small handful of people around the country that can do it. So that's an example of a case where something very harmful happened to a victim. She had no lawyer, no say, no seat at the table, if you will, and I was able to help her. The other case, I have a case out of West Virginia where a little girl who was brutally raped was then, right before the case started for trial, the defense attorney said, "Your Honor, I'd like you to order that girl to submit to a forced examination of her genitals, okay, to determine the condition of the interior of her body." And of course, the prosecutor and I were both thinking, you can't do this. You can't literally rape a child in the name of justice. She's already been attacked. She's already been violated. You can't do that to a human being. It's not only indecent, it's a crime. And the fact that a judge orders it doesn't make it any less of a crime. Mm-hmm. So again, I was able to get involved in that case. And that's the kind of case I work on. When constitutional violations happen to victims of violence, they don't have a lawyer, they don't have a seat at the table. I build us a seat at the table.
So that really does make a difference. I know you had a case with a victim who had aphasia, who wasn't able to speak.
Another really great case. That was right here in Massachusetts. A woman who was sexually violated at a nursing home in Sudbury by an aide who had previously attacked another elderly woman, only she had dementia. And although she knew what happened, she couldn't remember reliably, so the guy was allowed to keep his job. And then, of course, he picked on a woman he thought couldn't tell because she had aphasia, which is a condition some people have after a stroke, which means not that they're not capable and smart or unintelligent, they just can't narrate, they can't form sentences. And so my client, Ruby, was really great. I mean, she was so gung-ho that she was going to do something because she knew he picked on her because she couldn't speak, and he thought she could never tell. But she lucked out. Among other things, the detective who showed up to take Ruby's statement had a grandmother with aphasia. And long story short, the judge in the criminal case, at the behest of the perpetrator's lawyer, forced Ruby to submit herself to a competency hearing, at the end of which Ruby was declared incompetent to testify in a court of law. She was outraged, her family was outraged. Thankfully, I heard about the case, because again, it was a test case I had been looking for, because my argument was, you're violating her rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act by finding her incompetent to take the stand in a court of law. You're basically rendering her vulnerable to any kind of criminal attack by putting a target on her back. She can't testify. And oh, by the way, she's perfectly competent. You just have to respect her disabilities and accommodate them. So we went to court and said to the judge, you have to reverse your decision. You can't find her incompetent. In fact, to the contrary, you have to honor her disabilities and allow her to testify by answering yes and no style questions, which she does perfectly well, and to use gestures. I mean, she could point to the parts of her body that had been violated. Let her use charts or pictures if necessary. Just don't demand of her full sentences, because her disability prevents her from doing that. We ultimately not only won, but won a landmark ruling, first of its kind in the nation, that says people with disabilities not only have a right to a wheelchair ramp to get them into the courthouse, which is historically what we think about when we think about the Americans with Disabilities Act and courthouses, but what happens once they're there? What if they can't communicate in a court of law? You can't just put them in the wheelchair and plop them in the courtroom and not then take care of their needs with regard to testimonial participation in the courtroom. And I loved this case so much because Ruby was so strong and she was so committed to justice. But she also got back at the defense attorney because in the competency hearing itself, he knew she could only answer yes and no questions. He stood in front of her and blocked the view of the perpetrator and then said to her, "Do you see the man who committed the offense in the courtroom today?" And of course she couldn't say yes because she couldn't see him, but she also couldn't say no because she knew he was there, nor could she say, get out of my way so I can see. So she cried. I mean, that's one of the problems, is she was so frustrated in her body that she started crying, and again, that was part of why the judge found her incompetent. Well, we eventually she got restored her competency, she got to testify, and when that moment came again, you wouldn't believe this, but the defense attorney again stood up to block her view when that moment came, only this time she went to point at him, defense attorney stood up to block her view, and she went like this. She waved him out of the way, and it was embarrassing. I was going to stand up and object, but she was better with her finger than I could have been with my objection. And out of pure humiliation, he eventually stepped back, and she went, yes, yes, yes. Tell you, one of the best moments of my professional career.
That must have been an amazing
Loved
moment.
Loved it.
You've also done a lot of work involving colleges and universities. Tell us how Title IX of the Civil Rights Act applies.
Yeah, I mean, such a good question. I bet, for the most part, people think of Title IX and probably think your question has something to do with equal distribution of basketballs or sports equity. Right. But in fact, that's not the kind of work I do. I do lots of work enforcing Title IX at the high school and higher ed levels, universities all over the country, to require them to comply with Title IX as it applies to sexual assault, which is a huge problem. An epidemic, frankly, especially in universities all over the country. And not only does Title IX apply to sexual assault, it applies to domestic violence, dating violence on campuses. Lots of victims don't understand this. Lots of schools don't understand it. Regular people who care about civil rights and understand that Title IX is important to women and women's equality don't understand it. So I've done a ton of training and written some law review articles and so forth just to get the word out, because again, it's about elevating the nature of violence against women to its rightful seat at the civil rights table. We understand when violence happens to somebody based on religion, based on ethnicity, based on fill in the blank, that's a civil rights problem. Well, Title IX is a direct derivative of the Civil Rights Act. So of course we should be talking about it and thinking about it as having responsibility to deal with women's inequality in education, not sports equity, but equality. And what's the most severe form of discrimination that women endure? It's not unequal access to basketballs. It's sexual harassment, it's physical violence, it's domestic abuse, it's sexual assault. And my work in the past 20 years has been to really change the conversation about Title IX and get us talking about it as a civil rights issue. So I have a lawsuit pending right now against Yale, Harvard Law School, Princeton University, in my cases, are both currently under investigation for violating Title IX in the way they handle sexual assaults on campus. I've handled cases involving Brown. I mean, it's interesting how many Ivy League schools are in my list of problem schools. And, reasonable people argue that it's because they have the most entitled males. It's also the D1 schools, the schools with the athletes that are protected. We all saw what happened at Boston University, although good for them, they've moved in a better direction. But, athletes disproportionately commit assaults and violence against women on campus and never get in trouble for it. And so, of course, then they commit more. The same goes for all kinds of guys who feel entitled to cause harm to women, and they expect not to be held accountable. Well, I'm trying to make schools do their jobs, enforce Title IX by holding these guys accountable, and boy, do we have a lot of work to do.
Well, are the schools moving in the right direction?
Yeah, they really are, in part because of some of the impact litigation I've been doing, but other people around the country as well have been complaining and saying, my goodness, something like 1 in 4 girls is raped during her 4 years in school. Only 5% report because schools generally want to do scandal avoidance, right? They don't want to be known as a place where rape happens. So they are predisposed to side with the perpetrator, not just because they like protecting guys, but they like protecting themselves from the public perception that they have rape problems. But make no mistake about it, all colleges have rape problems. And any parent that's thinking about where to send a daughter, be very, very wary when you see what are called Clery Act statistics, which is the annual report card schools have to produce the 1st of October every year, a public report card. How many crimes on campus have you had in your past 3 years? Lots of schools, because of how they unfairly treat victims, have artificially low numbers. And ironically, it's the schools with higher numbers that are probably safer for women because they're measuring things correctly, telling the truth about the data, which means they're probably doing a better job dealing with it because they want to correctly and fairly reduce their actual numbers. Lots of the elite schools have profoundly false data in the sense that they might say, oh, we had 7 or 10 rapes last year, when if you looked at other sources of information, the number could be as high as 80 or 90.
Well, how can you force them to give out the correct information?
Well, Clery Act is, it's a good question because for the longest time when the Clery Act was first passed by Congress, it didn't carry sanctions, so nobody complied. They all lied or they didn't produce a report at all, or very few schools complied. Then Congress added a sanction. So it's a $27,500 per sanction violation, and suddenly schools are paying attention because they don't want to pay, that's a pretty big fine. So they're doing a better job. But in the meantime, because they are worried about telling the truth, they've actually gotten much worse at dealing responsibly with the problem. And they've done that by deterring victims from reporting because they figure if no one reports, they don't have to count it. So I've been fighting against that for 20 years now, really trying to say to schools, I don't want to have a fight with you. You should care about women and the atmosphere in which they're learning. They're entitled to an equal educational opportunity because that's what the Civil Rights Act says. You should be celebrating and embracing and supporting women's need and right to earn in an environment where they don't feel disproportionately at risk for this kind of harm. You should be celebrating women's status and wanting to embrace this and be sending the opposite message, that the way you keep your real numbers down is by sending the message to the harm doers. Don't you dare touch a woman or you'll be expelled and criminally prosecuted. It's hard to get schools on board with that because they like the tuition dollars. They don't want to expel rapists. They lose their tuition dollars. Well, we as women collectively have to start to make it financially painful for schools to do the wrong thing. And that's a tough row to hoe. But we're moving in the right direction.
Well, that's good at least. When we see you on the news, you're often talking about some little girl who's disappeared or been found dead. And in those very sad stories, it seems to me they happen more now than they used to. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, it's hard to know whether they happen more or we're hearing more about them because obviously news is readily available on your phone and the internet and 24/7 cable stations. And my experience, though, is that we are both hearing about it more and it's happening more. And I say that for a lot of reasons, including because of the internet, this tremendous uptick in child pornography globally. What was once a relatively small piece of the global pornography business is now pretty substantial. I read a federal decision recently that cited the number at something like $22 billion. Just child pornography, $22 billion a year industry. Most makers are parents. Most makers and users are American.
The people who make the pornography are the parents of the children
Most often.
who are appearing in it?
Most often. Mostly because parents are looking for money and they can make money, and now you can make money in the privacy of your home where, if that's what you see fit to do, it's hard to police that behavior. Often drugs are used to sedate the kids, and they're the kind of drugs that not only keep them compliant, but they have amnestic features like benzodiazepines and things like that, and rape drugs like Rohypnol and so forth.
They cause amnesia.
They cause amnesia. So the kids can't tell because they can't remember. So it's a really hard problem to police. And it's, such a profitable industry. I hate to even use the word industry because that gives it legitimacy, but it's such a big business that I think it has contributed substantially to the uptick in actual incidents. And, the problem is I think we're so uncomfortable with the topic that sometimes when we hear about a little girl who goes missing, Casey Anthony is a perfect example, by the way, and I wrote a book about the case. I was the only person in the country who predicted she would be acquitted, and it was because I read all the stuff I could get my hands on, and it seemed pretty clear to me Casey Anthony did not kill her daughter, but she was involved in behavior that had to do with sexual exploitation, pornography, sexual sale of her child. I mean, it's hard to know the details because a lot of that was under court order, was sealed from the trial that we all watched. But enough of it came out that, and that's one of the reasons I wrote my book. I said, so she didn't directly kill her child, but she was involved in nefarious business with bad people. And that happens, you can't just get involved in drugs and pornography and not place your child at risk. So for me, when I'm on the news and I see some little girl ends up dead, John Benet Ramsey, clearly, in my opinion, victimized by familial sexual abuse related to pornography. I mean, there's just no question that was not a stranger abuse case, but if you watch the news, you might not know it. We're so uncomfortable with seeing the truth about these cases that I think it's hard to go there because it's so disturbing, right? But we have to. If we're going to protect kids, if we're going to make a difference, if we're going to fight this scourge of both sexual abuse of children and child pornography, we have to open our eyes. And that means every time, especially a little girl, because they are the most desirable, the most valuable, every time a little girl goes missing or ends up dead or disappears from her home in the middle of the night or ends up in a swamp somewhere, the first thing we should be asking is, were her parents involved in drugs or child porn? And then come back from that, because that is often the explanation.
That is astounding.
I know. People don't like to hear it, but it's important that we accept and be comfortable in our discomfort if we're going to protect kids.
I'm glad you explained that. Can you tell us, just shifting a little bit, what your opinion is about the Innocence Project?
Again, one of my pet peeves. I have a whole chapter on it, by the way, in my book, which is soon coming out in paperback.
Here's your book, And Justice for Some.
Thank you. It's sold out in hardcover, which is a good thing, I guess.
When will it be out in paperback?
Soon is
Good.
all I can
okay.
say.
And
soon.
How can people get it?
Well, ultimately, the publisher will produce a website from which it can be ordered, and I have no doubt it will be available for Kindle and on Amazon and so forth. Unfortunately, I keep being told 2 more weeks, so soon.
Sometime soon.
Yeah. Be nice if it came out in time for Christmas gifts.
Yes.
And, the only thing I can say is I have a chapter about the Innocence Project in there, but what's important to me is that the public understand probably the most important truth about it, which is to say, they tell the public that all these guys who get released from prison because of new DNA tests on old evidence in almost exclusively rape and sex crimes cases, somehow proves the man is innocent, proves he never had anything to do with the crime. Then the guy is released from prison, there are balloons, everybody's celebrating. Then he sues the government and gets my tax dollars in a settlement for millions of dollars. And the truth is, because I've looked at the numbers, I've looked at the data, my students and I have studied their cases, about 90% are in fact guilty defendants, guilty of the crime. And the only reason they're being released is because new DNA tests on old evidence proved that there was some other DNA at the crime scene, which for a lot of these cases is the woman's body, the victim's underwear. Just because she had someone else's DNA in the crime scene doesn't mean the perpetrator didn't do it. And I think we have to start asking ourselves, why are we not challenging these news stories that purport to prove these guys are all innocent? Because it hurts women, and let me tell you why. Among other things, we now have a whole culture of people who think disproportionately women must be wrong or lying about being raped, because so many of the Innocence Project cases are sex crimes against women and children. And I think, don't they understand? The Innocence Project intentionally chose sex crimes cases because they knew they were going to be able to make this argument, this crazy argument, that as long as someone else's DNA shows up at the crime scene, they're going to get the guy out of prison and sue for millions. There's a ton of money being made by people connected to the Innocence Project. This is not a pro bono effort. This is not a bunch of volunteer lawyers doing it for the good of the justice system, although a lot of lawyers, a lot of law school students donate their time to help. I don't think they realize that they're really helping to make money at the end of the day for these guys who are guilty often of both rape and murder and winning millions of dollars and then moving into our neighborhoods, and we falsely think that they're innocent. We can't even protect ourselves from what might be a serious risk of harm because we're being falsely made to believe the guy had nothing to do with it, which is almost always wrong.
And yet the Innocence Project has everyone bamboozled. Why can't we turn this around so that people understand?
I don't know. I mean, I've tried, well, I have thoughts about why. I've tried really hard to get the mainstream media to pay attention to this and to at least put in the story, this doesn't prove that he didn't do it.
It may prove that the victim had consensual sex with some other man.
Right, good, thanks for clarifying that. Right.
It has nothing to do with whether or not the defendant raped or otherwise assaulted the woman.
That's right. In fact, that is almost always the case, especially for the early stage cases where, you know, if you were designing the Innocence Project and you wanted a good chance that you were going to find in the rape kit or in the, you know, underwear evidence that there was another man involved, you would choose two kinds of cases. One, a woman who was sexually active, maybe a prostituted woman, and by the way, those kinds of women are disproportionately vulnerable to rape, right? But they targeted women that they knew were sexually active because they were more likely to choose to find other male DNA there. Terribly, in my opinion, discriminating against a very vulnerable class of people. But they also were choosing cases where there were more than one offender and where there was more than one offender involved. And you know, so if two guys get together and both attack a woman, but only one of them leaves DNA at the crime scene and both of them get convicted, if you're looking for the DNA of the guy who didn't leave his DNA at the crime scene, you're not going to find it. And that's a guy who's walking around scot-free today, even though he's guilty. The Central Park jogger case is a perfect example. 6 guys involved, 1 older man, leader of the pack, if you will, 5 younger guys, all confessed. Most of them didn't have any sexual contact, but they were part of the gang activity, and the leader, the older guy, was the one who was actually the primary sex offender.
And they beat her almost to death, didn't they?
Almost to death. And they confessed in circumstances that were really quite reliable. They had, all but one had an adult with them when they confessed. The confessions were obtained in very reasonable circumstances. They're on videotape. You can see them. I mean, I watched them when I was being trained as a prosecutor. This is a good way to obtain a confession because it's fair. You don't want to beat a confession out of anybody, much less a young guy. But bottom line is they confessed, they were guilty, and right now they are suing New York for millions of dollars because the leader of the pack, the guy who did leave DNA at the crime scene, for reasons that remain mysterious, claimed to have acted alone, knowing full well that only his DNA was going to show up on her body. Again, when you overvalue DNA, you lose the point. You lose the truth, and truth matters.
Wendy, I hate to stop you, but we're almost out of time. Would you come back and do another show with us? Because I can see we have so much to talk about.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So that's all we have time for today. And thank you so much for being here, Wendy. This has been so interesting. I have learned so many things. We'll have you back to continue our conversation.
Great.
And until the next time, I would like to thank all of you for being with us today. And if you would like to be a guest on this show, you can email us at pearsonprofiles@gmail.com. And until the next time, be well and be kind. we'll talk with one person who's accomplishing something interesting these days. And we have one guest who has come back to do a second show, Wendy Murphy, who is a well-known legal analyst on many television shows and an adjunct professor at New England Law Boston. Wendy is an impact litigator who specializes in representing victimized women and children. And she has authored 2 books, many chapters of other books, and she's a regular columnist for the Patriot Ledger. She's been a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School. Her husband is also an attorney with whom she has 5 children. And so, Wendy, thank you so much for coming back again to do another show with us, because we had so much to talk about with you.
Yeah, yes, we did. We could do 5 shows.
Yes, I bet we could. So one of the things I know people are interested in is that you've worked with many of the most notable news hosts across the country. And so tell us which ones really stand out in your mind.
Just don't ask me to tell you stories that could make the scandal pages.
Well, I will ask you, but...
Yeah, but I can't tell. I can't tell. Well, first of all, I've been doing TV for, I think, on almost 20 years. So I've probably worked with everybody a little bit, and some more than others. I formally and did, in fact, work as an employee for NBC and CBS and CNN, all as contract employment. I was hired to do some work by Bill O'Reilly for Fox News. So I've been all over in terms of politics and ideologies, and I certainly have a sense of the way the business works. And I certainly have opinions about who I liked and maybe didn't like as much. I will say this. It's amazing how difficult the job is. I think when you watch people on television, they make it look easy. You think it's easy, and it isn't. And a lot of these folks, even the seemingly beautiful people, are often really, really smart, talented people. And it's hard to know that sometimes because their skills aren't always on display. But when you realize that they have to think quick on their feet and stay up on all the news of the day and process lots of information quickly, most people are really, really intelligent. The other thing I would say is that despite what you might see as a gruff appearance, most of them are very down to earth, very grounded, very decent people, because I think they learn very quickly that it's a superficial business, and if you're going to be a real human being, you have to get over that very quickly. So most people, I think, are very grounded. There are a few divas, there are some prima donna types. I won't necessarily name names, but I will say that by far my favorites include Bill O'Reilly, who, in the beginning, when I started working with him, again, going back since the beginning of his show, we didn't always agree. We still don't always agree. But what I loved about him was his interest in letting people be heard and letting issues be aired. So, for example, he might have me on and slam me for whatever I was saying, but he always let the voices be heard of people even with whom he disagrees. I love that about him. So
you're saying he doesn't have you on so much because you always agree with him?
Oh, no. I mean, yes. He doesn't. And there are shows that will only have on certain types who only say certain things. And certainly politics is one of the topics where people are literally going on programs to spin their sides of issues, especially during big campaign seasons. But I think for Bill O'Reilly, he always rose above it for me because I knew how some of the other programs worked, and he was different. He was always different, and he's still different. And he's also just a very nice guy who has always been very kind to me. He supports one of my charities, the Alexa Foundation. It happened to Alexa Foundation. And, all I did was call him up one day and say, here's what we do. We give money to victims who don't have enough money to either pay for a bus ticket or a plane fare to get to a courthouse so they can testify against a predator, a criminal, a sex predator most often. And, that's all we do. We give money to people who can't afford to get to the courthouse. And he immediately said, whatever you need, Wendy, sign me up. And why I tell that story about him is that most people would say, especially people with his power, and he's got a tremendous amount of influence, might say, who's on the board? What's in it for me? he didn't say that. He said, that's an important foundation, sign me up, whatever you need. And he's been with us ever since, and almost without fanfare. He just does what we ask, and he's always coming to our events, and he does it all in his own dime. And, a guy like that doesn't come across that way on television because he's kind of tough on TV. But it's really important for me to know that these are real people behind the scenes. I've loved so many of my. I love Geraldo. Love him.
What's he like off the air?
Well, again, a very grounded guy who, even when he was doing, these crazy shows with people throwing chairs at him and stuff, there was such a real person there, and he's a good dad, and he doesn't think of himself, as an important person. He's very, very sincere. I remember one time coming out of a studio and bumping into him in Boston, because he has family here in Boston, or down in Marion, and he was driving himself. And I said, "You're driving yourself around. Where's your driver?" And he said, please, I'm so above getting a driver. And that's a way about him that few people know, because he really is kind of a superstar, rock star as TV news goes. And he's really smart, and he's decent and kind and giving. And again, you don't necessarily know that, because he's often talking tough on TV. So two of my favorites are definitely Geraldo. I love Jim Braude. Our local guy on New England Cable News, I think, is just terribly undervalued and should be on national TV, because he's so smart, so fast on his feet, so witty, works so hard, and again is a really generous, incredibly down-to-earth guy, and we're so lucky to have him.
Well, you've been filling in for him on his show.
Yeah, which are big
tell everybody
shoes
where they can see that.
Well, on New England Cable News, right, where he does his television show, Broadside the News with Jim Braude, a daily show.
What time is it on?
Well, it's on at 6, and then it reruns most days of the week at 8. I have filled in, which was, again, much harder than it looks, and really tough for anybody to be as talented. And I joked when they called me, I said, what, am I the only one stupid enough to go on and be compared to the best guy on TV? But he's so kind and so helpful, and was very supportive of me. And, I still am going to fill in for him, in part because he is so generous in helping me learn the business. And so some great people, I have to say, who, in a very superficial world, are both accomplished and have managed to stay grounded.
That is good to know. But when you're on those shows, we often see you only from the waist up. And people wonder, what are you wearing from the waist down?
Well, today it's a skirt. Yeah, well, I do sometimes tell the truth about this, which is especially in the morning shows, because I do the Today Show a fair amount, and I've been on all the morning shows, and that's really early stuff. So you're going to want to crawl out of bed and do as little as possible, because it's early.
Yeah, what time do you get out of bed for
Well,
that?
I would get out at 5-ish and
5
get
a.m.
ready and get to the studio, and then got to do the hair and the makeup and put, so I tend not to get changed from the waist down. It is true that very often, especially in the morning, I'm in pajamas from the waist down.
Okay.
In fact, can I tell you something funny?
Yes.
Once at the studio, again, one of these early mornings when Mitt Romney was governor of Massachusetts, he and I were in the same studio, and I was in my pajamas from the waist down and saying hello to him, and I said, "Good to meet you, Governor." And, I knew him, and I had served on his Crime Commission and Commission Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. So I think he certainly knew me, and he knew I worked on television. And boy, was he polite, because I thought, if I ran into somebody and saw them in their pajamas, I would probably say, "What the hell are you doing in your pajamas?" But he didn't embarrass me. He couldn't have been nicer.
Well, in fact, you find your work is very nonpartisan, right? Your work, neither major political party fits in exactly correctly with what you think ought to be done.
That's right, because my expertise as an advocate for victims of violence is always moving, right? In terms of where I find my allies. The issue today, I might find my ally in a Republican, tomorrow it might be a Democrat. And because it's almost always victimized women and children, I'm famous for saying, abuse of women is a bipartisan male entitlement. Historically, it just is. And neither side is always good. I have seen Mitt Romney do terrific things as governor on behalf of women in Massachusetts and victims of crime. And I've seen Democratic leaders sometimes step up. It's so important if you do this kind of work, anti-violence work, not to be partisan, because sometimes that silences you when you want to speak out because a Democrat has done something sexually inappropriate, for example, or sexual harassment. You don't want to be told you can't complain because we need that person to be on our side for other partisan issues or funding issues. Bill Clinton comes to mind. When he got caught with Monica Lewinsky, and then there was Juanita Broaddrick and Paula Jones. The National Organization for Women did not criticize him, would not criticize him, refused to criticize him. And I thought, well, what is that about? You are not the national organization for some women. You're not the national organization for Democrat women. Why would you not speak out? This is outrageous behavior. And they didn't. And that was the beginning of my commitment, really, to nonpartisan work, because I thought if that's the cost of taking the benefits of having a guy like Bill Clinton do good work on behalf of domestic violence victims, which he did, that's too big a price for me to pay. And so I've had, there's been a lot of stress. Most people in this business, and even the anti-violence people in Massachusetts, the Jane Doe and the rape crisis centers and so forth, generally speaking, they will never speak out against a Democrat. They will always speak out against a Republican because they are first pro-Democrat partisans, and second, in my opinion, supportive of victims. And for that reason, I can't support them. I think they do some good work some of the time, but if your commitment is first to shoring up votes for the Democrats, if you are a shill for the Democrats, you're not putting the well-being of women first, and you should not be in the business.
Wow, that is something to absorb.
It's an ugly secret that a lot of people are starting to talk about. And it's not just a Massachusetts problem. It really is a national problem, disproportionately in certain states more than others. But, we have to get past that. We have to be able to say, whatever needs to be done, violence against women is such a huge problem. And children. 5 kids die every day from abuse in this country. At least 3 women are raped every day in this country. Are killed every day in this country from abuse. Thousands of women and children are raped every day in this country. It's such a big problem that almost all women polled in a recent survey, when asked what are their political priorities, put violence against women as a most important priority, at the top of the list of concerns, way ahead of free contraception and abortion even. And so I think women have to be careful not to be forced to choose, well, the Democrats said this was your women's issue, and the Republicans said this is the women's issue. We don't want to be told what our issue is, right? If our issue is safety in our homes, safety on our streets, then we don't care that the left and the right want us to be pegged and pigeonholed into feeling strongly about their things. I care about jobs. I care about the economy. I care about violence more than free contraception. What does that make me? A nonpartisan. Good. That's what we all should be.
Are there any other deep, dark secrets you think that everyone ought to know? Now's your chance to tell them.
Oh my goodness. If you read my book, you'll see incredible stories about some pretty ugly stuff that is sometimes political, sometimes it's just about corruption and wealth and influence interfering with access to justice, which people don't want to believe it. I mean, most of my clients come to me saying, I'm not only calling you because my wife, my child, myself, there was abuse and we need a lawyer. Most of my work, by the way, is volunteer work because a lot of my clients don't have money and they need justice. And if I required money, they wouldn't achieve it. And I feel so strongly about access to justice that if people have money, I'll take it. But if they don't, I don't decline them. So when they talk about, when they come to me and say, we don't have any money, or we do have money, but we're very upset. It tends not to be just this terrible thing happened, the abuse or the rape happened. It tends to be, we couldn't believe it when we tried to participate in the legal system, and the process of fighting for justice hurt us more. They feel betrayed. Mm-hmm. It's sometimes as simple as a judge, disrespecting them or treating them unfairly, or the prosecutor not bringing the right charges, or refusing to press charges, or dumbing down the charges, or giving out a plea bargain that's disrespectful. A rape is a rape. You don't ever reduce a rape charge to simple assault. And that happens so much in this state. It happens a lot. Prosecutors don't do right. Cops don't always treat victims with respect. They might, choose not even to arrest a guy because they don't like the fact that the woman was drinking. Women should be able to drink and do whatever else is legal, and march half naked down the middle of Main Street and not be subjected to violence without people saying, you deserved it. Nobody deserves to be victimized.
Of course no one deserves it, but I don't completely agree with you about that. I think that every person needs to take responsibility for herself.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be out in public and get drunk and not be able to take care of yourself, then you're opening yourself up to be a victim to everyone.
Yeah, you may be increasing your risk, but we have to be careful not to turn that increased risk into a reason to blame, because criminals bear 100% of the blame.
But I'm talking about going forward, not looking backward. Going forward, I would say to everyone's daughters and all young women everywhere, if you're going out, be responsible for yourself. You are responsible for yourself. Don't drink so much that you cannot take care of yourself in any circumstance.
As long as we're also saying that to men. Don't drink. Don't, because if you drink and someone steals your money, it's your fault. If you drink and you don't keep the front door to your house locked tight and somebody burglar breaks in, we got to blame the guy.
I see your point, absolutely.
As long as we don't just blame women.
I would not. But I would say that everyone has to take responsibility for themselves. And if you're going to get so drunk when you're not in your own home that you can't take care of yourself or get home or not drive, then you are at least partly at fault.
No, but here's the thing. You maybe should do a better job reducing your risk. But the problem is when a criminal exploits you because you're vulnerable, we have to be careful not to talk about blaming the victim, because that necessarily means we hold the criminal less responsible.
I agree.
There's only 100% of blame to go around.
I agree with you.
Always blame only the criminal is how I feel about the process, the criminal justice process.
I agree. Once it's in the process and once the crime has happened and you're looking back at it, do not blame the victim.
Right.
But I think everyone should be educated as to how not to become a victim.
I'll tell you what, if we're going to have a society where women are raped and beaten in the numbers that we have right now, I'll tell you what they should do. They should get guns. Every woman. That's the great equalizer. If we can't have a legal system that protects women and children, we have to give them power, and power can come in weapons. Now, mind you, I don't believe in guns as an idea generally. I think they're terrible. I don't even know people with guns. But I'm so angry that I live in a society where the legal system doesn't do right by women. I want to give them other tools, and I want men to be afraid. A woman might not be able to beat up a guy, but she can shoot him.
But Wendy, I mean, seriously, if all women had guns, don't you think a lot more people would be killed and injured every day by mistake?
Yeah, and a lot of women would be raped.
And a lot of women who are carrying them would be injured by them also.
I don't
think that's the answer.
I don't promote gun use. Don't misunderstand. What I'm saying is, it's a little bit like vigilantism. I hate vigilantism. I think it's wrong. But if the legal system can't work, if it continues to perpetuate violence against women by not caring enough to do the right thing and give women access to justice and children, then the natural response is for people to rise up and take matters into their own hands. And I want to scare the legal system into doing better.
Okay, but you know that there are large parts of the legal system that do work well. You and I both...
Not on this issue.
You and I both were prosecutors.
Not on violence
I
against women and
prosecuted
children.
Rape cases.
Well, you may have been good. The system is not good
anywhere. But the system is only made up of people who try to do their best, or we hope they try to do their best. And when I was a prosecutor, I tried to make the system be not broken.
You were very good. I was very good. But here's some data. In 1993, in support of the Violence Against Women Act, Joe Biden gave data to Congress that showed only 2% of rapists ever spend one day behind bars. That was in 1993. They ran the numbers again in 2012. You know what the number is today?
No.
A whopping 2.5%. That's what I mean. The systems don't work.
Well,
and I am up to here with it, and I'm telling you, if the legal system doesn't get better, women will become vigilantes. Women will get weapons. That's the only way to protect ourselves when in the name of law, we say, sorry, the violence against women and children doesn't matter. You give us no choice. That's my answer.
Well, I don't agree with you, but I understand why you feel that frustrated about it. Let's talk about your other foundation, the 100 Club.
Oh, I love the one. I love that you called it the 100 Club.
Isn't that what it's called?
Well, it's called the 100 Club, but
I'm sorry.
But it is technically 100.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. So the 100 Club, founded over 50 years ago by one of my dear friends, Norman Knight, who is a lovely philanthropist. I love this man, love him. We give money to families of firefighters and police officers who die in the line of duty. It really is that simple. And my dad was a firefighter, recently retired. He actually became chief of his department. He was the chief in Newton some years ago. And when I was a little girl, I remember my dad coming home one time and saying that a firefighter friend of his had died in a fire. And it was the first time I thought, wow, my dad has a scary job. I didn't think of myself as having a father with a dangerous job until that moment. I was probably 8. And he was really upset. And he said, you know, they're going to help the family, and there's a special fund. A man, he didn't mention his name, but a man created a special fund that will help his family, and the kids can go to college. And I thought, oh, that's great. I remember feeling very warm about that. Well, flash ahead, 40 years later, I run into a man at the 9/11 memorial in Boston, and he starts talking to me, and I didn't know him, and he just approached me, and we started talking. And as he's telling me his story about who he was and how he had proposed the funding to pay for the memorial, the hair on my arms went up, and I thought, I know you.
That
You're
was the man your father talked about.
Yes, and I had such goosebumps about it. And so I said, I have to tell you about my story when I was a little girl and so forth. Anyway, we've been dear friends ever since. And the 100 Club is, it's a little known organization that when a disaster happens, when a tragedy strikes, when a police officer dies in the line of duty, a firefighter dies in a house fire, the feeling about the club is so important, and what they do for the families is just a momentous event for them, and it stays. With Norman then sends flowers to the wife, on Mother's Day and so forth. Just, it's such a loving environment, and we want people to know, because in part, it's not going far enough that we only become known to people when tragedy strikes. We want other people to celebrate the nature of our ongoing relationships with these families, sometimes 20, 30, 40 years later.
It sounds like a wonderful cause.
It's a really good cause.
And are they doing well? Do they have enough money to contribute to all the families that need them?
Well, it's a good question. You can go to the100club.org and find out more about how to donate if you want to. We do have very generous supporters, but we can always use more money. And I say that because firefighters and police officers are often in danger.
They're always
and
in
harm's
danger.
way, and they always have problems that we try to help with.
That's a good thing to do. And tell us about how you manage doing all this with being the mother of 5 children. How do you manage all
I reject the premise of the question. Did I say I managed? Where is that written?
Then you're allowed to say you don't manage it.
I don't. And I say that, or as I've jokingly said in the past, when my children are not having good days, I don't take the blame. And when they're superstars, I don't take the credit. And the truth is, I take a little bit of blame and a little bit of credit, I guess. They have always benefited from a 3-parent family. Let's be honest. I have had the pleasure and the great fortune of always having a babysitter on board. And our most recent and most long-standing sitter was fabulous. She was a better parent than I could. And I mean that. She was fantastic. I still love her. I still see her a lot. I missed her when she left us because I no longer had kids that were home during the day. But having a third parent, having a full-time caregiver, changes everything. And not all families can do that, and I certainly appreciate that. But, here's how I manage it, and this is political correctness at its best. Number one, having three parents. Number two, I don't cook and I don't clean, and that includes that. And I don't always pay somebody to do anything either. That means if you come to my house and there's piles of stuff all over the place, I fully expect you to say, "I love your piles." I really appreciate that.
I've never seen your house look uncleaned.
Well, it's probably because we don't have as much stuff anymore. 3 of my kids are out of the house and in college or grad school, and I don't like clutter. So that's probably why you think it's clean. You haven't done the white glove test.
No, and I wouldn't either.
No, and it would be ugly.
And don't you do it at my house.
I won't. But I really feel strongly that women have to be so good to each other when these issues come up that we shouldn't be saying, "What do you mean you don't cook?" I mean, sometimes I tell stories about having to leave my child in a hospital bed to get to court, or I gave birth on a Sunday night on purpose so that I could get to the Supreme Judicial Court on Wednesday morning with a 2.5-day-old baby, because I had to do that.
And you took her with you.
I took her
to
with
the
me
Supreme Judicial Court
with a babysitter. And I've had to do those things, leaving the bedside of my sick son who was in the hospital to go to a court hearing was devastating for me to do, but it had to be done. And when I tell those stories, I sometimes have gotten, because I've written about it in columns for the Patriot Ledger, for example, and I sometimes get cruel emails from women who say, you should be ashamed of yourself. You're a terrible mother. Why would you do that? And, part of why I write about it is because I do have some degree of, I don't want to say guilt, but, I question my choice sometimes. Why did I go? Why did I do that? But it was the right thing to do at the time. I live with it, and the consequences, weren't harmful to my children when I've done things like this. But I think it comes from a culture where we are always doubting whether we're making the right choice. It's one of the reasons when I give lectures about what people call the work-life dilemma, I say, please, let's not talk about balance. Balance is such a dirty word to me because it necessarily suggests when you choose one thing, you're dissing the other thing, and when you choose one thing, you're necessarily rejecting the other. Men don't say that. Men don't say, I'm balancing my work life and my home life. They just live. Women need to do that. They just need to say, don't make a judgment about whether I chose this over that. We do stuff, and stuff includes some of the time we're at work and some of the time we're at home, and some of the time we're at the soccer field. And for me, when people say, well, you don't cook, that's terrible, I say, but I make my kids eat good food, and I go to their soccer games instead of cooking. How is that the wrong decision?
Your husband used to be a chef. He's a good cook. He may not have time to do the cooking, but right. He is a good cook.
He is a good cook. He doesn't practice on me nearly enough anymore. He's more like a good griller.
And you're a vegetarian, we should say. And
fishitarian, pescatarian.
Oh, okay, you're a pescatarian. I'm sorry that we're almost out of time now. And I just want to thank you for coming back again to do a second show with us.
Great fun.
I feel like we could do a third.
We could. And then again, and a fourth.
Thank you so much. And thank all of you out there for joining us today. If you'd like to be a guest on this show, please email us at pearsonprofiles@gmail.com. And until next time, be well and be kind.